Welcome to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast, a bi-weekly talk show that exclusively talks about India's space activities. When you look at the landscape of successful space businesses, you will see that one of the key features of that landscape is actually having an excellent space policy or a legislative framework that helps doing business in space. For the last 60 years, although we in India have an extremely good space program which is government driven, we do not have a landscape for space policy or legislation that centrally focuses on putting the interest of space industry into its core focus. However, with the emergence of many of the new space players today, there is indeed a need for such an instrument to come up. My guest today in this episode of the NewSpace India podcast is Deepika Jayakodi. Deepika is a commercial contracts and bid manager at Airbus Defence and Space in the Netherlands. Before she moved to the Netherlands, she was a practicing lawyer in India with 5 years of legal experience. The number of lawyers in India who have a core background in law and understand the space policy or space law landscape is a very small subset. And Deepika is one of those people. Post her legal education at the undergraduate level, she's pursued a master's in space law in the Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this episode, we talk about her journey of coming to be a space lawyer and her insights of having worked in the commercial space industry, her opinion and the critique of the draft space bill put together in India. Deepika, welcome to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast. Thank you so much for taking time on a weekend to speaking to me.
Thank you, Narayan.
Let's actually begin with talking about how you actually got into space and how did you get fascinated about space and building a career in space-related activities?
Okay, I think my fascination for space, it's the story behind that is not too novel. It comes from when I was a child, when we are looking at cartoons and videos and books, that you're fascinated about rockets and wanting to be an astronaut and things like that. And at a certain stage when I was in school, I was really interested in astrophysics. That was the line that I wanted to pursue. One of my teachers went to great lengths to get the students in my class be really inspired about everything in space. So I think that instilled a strong root within myself. And the next part of transition came when I was at a stage where I had to pick which group I choose in school. At that point, I decided that I wanted to do law, but I was still thinking back on, all the aspirations I have had towards doing something in the field of science or engineering. And I remember reading a book called Pocket Law, which spoke about air and space law, which was completely new. I mean, law as a field of study itself was new for me. And I thought, hey, if there's something to do with aviation and space, maybe I could also become a space lawyer at some point. So this was the time when a stage was set for me. And then I did go on to do law. I completely forgot about aviation and space law. I was practicing in India for about 5 years, at which point during a dinner with a few senior advocates and judges, I heard from someone that I should think about doing a master's in space law at the Leiden University. I had absolutely no idea where this place was, but I ended up applying. I ended up getting a seat here. And that's how my career in space began.
So you said you had read this, pocket dictionary or something regarding air and space law. So at what age or what time was it really?
I think this was when I was in my 10th grade. So it was a book that my dad brought back from his work. He'd borrowed it for a few days, and it was just talking about law in general and what different fields of law people study or practice in. And there was this very small section that I vividly remember. It was about aviation and space, and it spoke about the Outer Space Treaty. For me, out of the whole book, this seemed to be super fascinating because everything else was something that was quite familiar. It was about banking, it was about real estates, it was about crimes. And I think somewhere in my mind, I thought, yeah, this sounds interesting. I could be a space lawyer at some point. But then I don't think once I started studying law, I ever went back to the thought that I should pursue space law. So there was a huge gap between when I made the decision and when I came back to do a master's in space law.
So the 5 years that you practiced law when you graduated, then you actually were not really thinking about doing space law on a day-to-day basis. You just stumbled upon it once, you were talking to some of your colleagues then.
Yes, I think in retrospect, if I think about it, international law was one of my favorite subjects at the university. So my first master's was again at the Madras University, was on international law and Indian constitutional law. So there, my interests were still more to do with cyberspace, let's say the laws of war, the laws of sea. And these were the topics that space law completely fell off my, let's say, my memory. And it wasn't until this person told me, hey, you should consider doing space law. And then I thought, oh, this is something I did want to do way back, but then I didn't take it too seriously. So it is only in retrospect that I think that, okay, every choice that I made somehow led me towards this path.
Yeah, when you were studying law, I guess not many people would have thought about space law, or even maybe in universities in India. There's not many universities in India who really talk about space as a subject in law in itself, right?
That's true. It's not a commonly spoken subject, but I think while I was doing my bachelor's, that was also the time where quite a few blogs were coming up, Indian blogs on international law, and you would see references to space law here and there, but it's not something that you can pick up and start working on. And it was probably me, or it was probably just the way things were, but it wasn't a serious topic of discussion even under international law. So, I mean, unless a person is really interested, I don't think it was a natural course that back then people could pick. And quite a lot has changed since when I did bachelor's to now, where you have space law components incorporated into either international law courses or even master's programs on space law. So it has changed quite a bit since back then.
So maybe it's a good opportunity now to speak about general perspective of what actually is space law and how it really has implications for countries.
Okay. So space law is not new. I think that's one of the first myths that need to be broken. Quite a lot of people quite a lot of academics back then have written about aviation and space law, which I assume sounded like pieces of pure fiction. The more concrete laws, or the stepping stone towards what is today known as the Outer Space Treaty, is a product of the Cold War, when both the US and Russia were planning on doing several activities or starting with activities in space. And the international community saw that we need to take steps towards preventing an arms race in space. So this was the goal, that they didn't want to repeat the mistakes made terrestrially in space too. So this gave birth to the Outer Space Treaty as we know it today. And you see that from 1967, when it came into force, until now, it has withstood the test of time. So the Outer Space Treaty, in general terms, it speaks about what you can and cannot do in space. And it predominantly dealt with what states or countries can and cannot do in space. Today, of course, by natural extension, this also extends to companies and people representing these companies in space. So the Outer Space Treaty, it talks about the freedoms in space. So the freedom to use and to explore outer space, to use it for scientific missions and so on. And to balance that, what sort of responsibilities you need to take into account when you exercise these freedoms. So the responsibility of the states to exercise jurisdiction and control over, let's say, organizations and people that perform these space activities, who is liable for what in space, what sort of liabilities come into force, how do you register objects that are put into space. So there's a whole range of things. And at the essence of it all is the peaceful use of outer space. There's a lot of debate on what exactly is peaceful use, how do we extend international cooperation in space, and so on. But essentially, all the debates, all these discussions are based on the principles that were set in the Outer Space Treaty from 1967.
And can you elaborate a bit about how actually India has been participating in the international space law realm, starting from the early 60s when space activities really started to kick off?
I would say India has been quite a strong proponent from the beginning. So if you look at the travaux préparatoires, forgive my French, but then the preparatory works that went towards building the Outer Space Treaty, you do see quite a lot of involvement from the Indian side on how they work with the international community, on how these principles are rounded off. So India has indeed been an active member in shaping these laws and playing a part with the big space powers, as you could call them, since the beginning. So apart from being actively involved with the shaping of the Outer Space Treaty, playing a part in the UN Corpus, which is the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, India has also played a part in shaping the Moon Agreement, or the Moon Treaty as we commonly know. India is one of the few signatories of the Moon Treaty, which is highly debated at this point of time, which would probably bring in a new level of discussions now that we are moving from an exploratory stage to an exploitative state of the outer space. So I would say India's presence in the shaping of space laws has been quite strong. What I am really looking forward to, though, is the Indian national space legislation, which will then put us on a map with the other countries that have incorporated international laws within the national spheres as well.
Did you have any, guides who were from India, did space law, and were practicing abroad, or what kind of career opportunities were there for you?
I must say that when I did make the choice, I was quite ignorant about what was happening within the space law field in India itself. So it was not until I got to Leiden that I knew that there were people that were actively involved in space law. So some of the people that I think the NewSpace India community already knows, Mrs. Ranjana Kaul, Dr. Sridhara Murthy, these were people that I met only after going to Leiden. And I think in a way it was very heartening to know that these people had already made the big steps, at least in the field of law and policy. And it was always nice to read their works, their opinions in different papers or articles, or even blogs that were upcoming them. And I think the first impressions from the Indian space law community was quite indirect, but very positive, to know that there were these people that I could go back to and talk to about things, have them mentor me, and so on. And it wasn't until 2015 IAC that I had the chance to meet some of them in person. And I think there we started talking about having a career opportunity in space law, what sort of things need to be done. And I think although it was limited in time, they gave me quite some valuable feedback. It was a bit funny that they all said, you need to stay abroad for a few more years before you come back to India, because I was quite eager to go back and start working on something space. But I don't think we were there yet, or at least for a young space lawyer, we didn't have the ecosystem yet to support things. And the advice that I did take from them was to really dive headfirst into how space industry works, how legislations, policies are shaped in what we consider a more developed space community, and then bring those lessons back to India at some point. And I think I have these things at the back of my head, even as I'm pursuing my career in Europe. And someday I hope to bring back the lessons that I've learned to the Indian space ecosystem.
When you said that the ecosystem is actually not there in India and you were advised to stay in Europe, what does that really mean? I mean, what forms a part of a space law ecosystem, and how is that matured here in Europe versus, not being present in India?
I think as far as the space law community goes, even at a global extent, it's quite small. And when you have to localize that to an Indian setting, it's even smaller. As far as I know, I would say there are probably less than 20 people that I know who are actively involved or who participated in something related to space law on a daily basis or on an annual basis. And I think what these mentors from the Indian community, they said then was things are just starting up. So it wasn't a pessimistic view. It was just that things are just starting up. The base is being set, and we will need more of space lawyers or people who are familiar with the policy and the legal context to come back at the near future. And I think what didn't exist at that point of time was that if you talk about space law, say at courts and things, it wasn't something that is easily perceived by people. It's not seen as a serious field of study or practice. And I think also within the space community, it has only been in the recent years that ISRO is going out to support the space industry as well, to accommodate more of these private players. So I feel like now is when the ecosystem is growing. So it's moved from a crawling stage to, let's say, stumbled walking stage, where there is enough room for space lawyers to work in. And I think one of the first things that I was really happy about was when the draft space legislation came out. There were quite a few, let's say, alumni from the Leiden Law University itself, who are in different parts of India, who are in different parts of Europe and the US now, who came together to provide a consolidated commentary on the draft. And I think that's the kind of ecosystem that you need to have all these people who are now working elsewhere to come back into the country to support the, let's say, the legal system for space activities as well. So that wasn't there yet 5 years ago.
When you look at India and ISRO, you talked about ISRO's participation in drafting of the international space laws and contribution to international space treaties. Did you have a chance to know anybody who is a part of the system, a part of the government of India, a part of ISRO, who are contributing to the space law effort, or how does it actually work with ISRO? Does ISRO have space lawyers?
I haven't had first-hand experience with space lawyers from India. I think that's a bit disappointing. I don't know if it's personally from my side or if it's within the community itself. The space lawyers that I've usually met within the context of conferences, external discussions, and these are usually at an international fora. I do know a few lawyers who are supporting the, say, ISRO with their contracts and things. But again, as I said, we are not yet at a stage where we are that mature that there's enough, let's say, meat for space lawyers to work with. And it's also not easy and open, I would say, within the international forum to meet people within the Indian space law community. The International Institute for Space Law is a great place to meet most of them. But apart from that, the people who are actually working with ISRO on the closest basis on who determines the policies or who determines what sort of procurement rules are put out, These are quite challenging to come by. And I think even in terms of the draft space bill, the access that I had towards it was just as any other public would have. I don't think I had any insider information on how this was being drafted, who were the parties who were involved, or how the feedback that a lot of people from the community, from the space community that we know, who is handling this feedback and what are they going to do with it. I think there's a lot to be done there still from the Indian side.
So you talked about how all of these activities for the draft space legislation is done. Can you give us a comparison of how a third country, an external country, let's say here in Europe, would actually do this in comparison to how it was done in India?
Sure. I think if we take things from the context of ESA and how ESA involves, let's say, the external factors to play a role in how they determine their rules and policies and regulations, it's quite different from the Indian setting now. ESA does take into account its different stakeholders, whether it's the industry, the academia, or the technical field. They do involve multiple stakeholders in how they shape their standards of practices, their regulations, and so on. So let's take, for example, in my day-to-day work, I would have to work with ESA's general terms and conditions, or specialized conditions for study proposals like artists and so on. And you do see that the agency is quite receptive to the feedback from the industry. They take a consolidated view from these different stakeholders. They try to reach a point where they can accommodate the interests of the different stakeholders, but also within the limits set by the agency itself. Of course, if you speak to the community here, they would say that there's a lot to be desired from that too. But I think there are lessons to be learned for us as well. We don't have to, within the Indian space community, we don't have to deal with things from scratch. There are a lot of lessons already learned that we can apply within the setting. And I think in terms of the space community we have extremely sharp people who can share this knowledge if only they are consulted. So I would say there is a lot of room for improvement, provided they take in the stakeholders within the Indian space community and give them an opportunity to actively play a role in how we develop this ecosystem together.
When you actually said about stakeholder involvement, it's a very broad term, stakeholder involvement. So it would actually be quite good to talk about what does stakeholder involvement mean and how does it actually, mature in terms of practice. So stakeholders practice, does it mean that people are just invited for open discussions, or there's a set date and there's a certain number of people invited, and how does it actually work?
I would say there are different frameworks or settings that are applied for the different needs. For example, if we think about how the Dutch national space legislation was shaped, there is a small satellite company that was struggling a bit with the whole concept of jurisdiction and control, the state supervision, the licensing mechanism for small satellites. And over there, you could see that the academics from Leiden University were working with the industry here and with the National Space Office to define, okay, what is really stopping this company from feeling secure? What does the law need to do in order to accommodate their interests, but also safeguard the interests of the Netherlands as a signatory to the Outer Space Treaty? And I think in this context, the stakeholder was the company itself. But then they were supported by the Space Office, by the academics, to come up with a more accommodative law, which in a way strengthens their business. It doesn't put things in an ambiguous format. It gives them the certainty that they need. And this was an example of stakeholder involvement for the national space legislation, for changing it for, let's say, more business accommodative or business conducive environments. And I think ESA also does that in different scales. You have the ministerial conferences. You have, for example, this ESA space debris offices has these different panels when they have to think about, okay, how do we technically deal with the problem of debris? And on another side, they would also have discussions with the legal community on, okay, what sort of checks and balances do we have to put in place in case this technology is adopted. So there are different methods, and I think it starts with identifying, okay, who are the stakeholders that will be most affected, or who are the stakeholders that will have the most, say, critical but constructive inputs towards shaping something as well.
You talked about how this company in the Netherlands was helped by Leiden University to then interface with the government and help create a legislative framework or even a national space policy that could be conducive for them to grow. But when you think about India, you talked about how there's a lack of people who are really into practicing space law. And you now see actually a lot of entrepreneurs that are upcoming and are trying to do their own satellites. There's even a company that's flown a couple of satellites of their own as private satellites. Now, given that we in India don't have a critical mass of space lawyers or institutions that are involved in space law, do you see that as a barrier to growth?
I see that more as an opportunity. I think we do have enough space lawyers. We do have very strong, let's say, legal faculties in India that practice international law. A natural extension is, of course, to also take into account space law. So it's only a matter of when things will start moving rather than will they start moving or not. I see the coming few years as the years during which there will be a lot of consolidation of who does what, where are centers of excellence in terms of academics, where are centers of competencies in terms of dealing with the different challenges that space activities can throw up, and how the legal community can support the ecosystem that's growing. So if you talk about the whether they are startups or medium or large companies that are coming forth in India that will be making spaceway, there is a lot of work that the lawyers can take up.
Let me just interrupt you there. For India to get to a level where a company like, for Indians or Indian startups to get to a level where you see this phenomena that you talked about, a Dutch company being supported, how will that evolve, and what is necessary for that to happen, and the process of it?
I think for such an environment to support the business, we need to begin with having open channels to ISRO, to Antrix, and to the Department of Space. And I think it starts with that, because as I said before, it's not entirely transparent how these policies, regulations, or mechanisms are set up. And when you are involving these private stakeholders, there is a sense of certainty and business conduciveness that needs to come with that. And by opening up challenges, by opening up channels, by identifying who the points of contact are, or who the groups of people are who can support the industry, or who can support with, let's say, even the most mundane things like contracting or picking up supply chain. How do you deal with procurement policies and so on? There needs to be open channels. There needs to be a transparency about who we work with within the Indian space community. I think it needs to begin with that. And the next step should be about openness. The whole point of having the space ecosystem support each other is that there is a give and take. And if we continue to act in a way that ISRO is the prime and everybody else is only seen as a supplier, that's not possible, or that's not enough to get the private industry up and running. So there should be, let's say, an environment where these voices are heard, and there's enough support also from the government towards enabling these industries. So let's say you want to have access or you need information about certain technologies, or let's say even certain standards and policies from a European or from a US entity. The government can support you through this in its capacity. I don't know how far this is being done, but there need to be organizations and groups that need to push these forward. It doesn't matter if it comes as a government, industry, space council, or whether these are a single window system through which you can access everything from licensing to post-operational support facilities and whatnot. But I would see that it has to be channels, transparency, and giving equal voices to the other players in the ecosystem.
You talked about the space activities draft bill and the critique or a feedback that you guys put together with the Leiden alumni group. Can you give a brief summary of what is your reading of the space activities draft bill and your response to that?
I would say that we got off on the right foot by wanting to enact a national space legislation. But the biggest disappointment for me came from the fact that this was seen as a move again from, let's say, top down. So this came from the government, and it didn't feel like they took into account the needs of the private industry. A lot of the people in India who are working with these different startups or organizations, I would say they do not have the backing of large space companies or other large entities. And in a way, if we need to see India as a large superpower, space power, where everybody has a certain role allocated to them, their needs have to be met as well. And what I saw that was lacking in the space activities bill was that it had a lot of obligations on the private industry. So one of the key points that I noted was on the liability provision. This was too heavy to be placed on the shoulders of private industry just at a time when they are kickstarting activities in India. So if you look at France, within their national space legislation, they have certain limits that they have set on, okay, to what extent is a private entity liable? To what extent do they have to have, let's say, insurance for activities that they have? And the rest is somehow apportioned to the state itself. These mechanisms within the space activities bill were missing. And also the whole part about setting up procedures on licensing. There was a lot of ambiguity on what exactly is a space activity, what are the commercial activities, and how are these licensing mechanisms going to be set out. So let's say a company that's going to run a downstream service, do they have to have the same licensing setup as somebody who might someday launch a satellite? I think there were questions like these that could have been addressed in far more depth within the space activities bill. And India being, let's say, one of the space leaders, they could have gone a step further to implement rules that are not yet discussed or not yet adopted entirely by the larger space community, like how do they tackle debris and so on. So it was a bit of a disappointment for some of the space lawyers, the way it came out. But at the same time, we do see a lot of opportunity. What I would really hope for there is that the comments or the feedback from the Indian space community and also those of those Indians who are abroad, that these are taken into account in the next stages, that they possibly start by having a stakeholder discussion on what else is needed, what else is required from the space activities bill before they put it out again.
When you look at the day-to-day activities of a launch company or even a satellite making company, for a launch company or a launch startup like Skyroot, who I also talked to, they talked about, getting access to launch pads, and for satellite making companies, they were talking about how do I get access to the frequencies, how do I export some of the products that I'm building. So these are the routine activities, and none of these actually feature as a part of the space activities bill. Do normally these kinds of activities feature as a part of legislation, or how is it actually being done?
I think there are different ways in this can be done. One is that it can be incorporated within the national space legislation itself. Another supportive mechanism would be to deal with the national space legislation as a framework that sets all the, let's say, the skeletal provisions, and then have policies and regulations support it. So let's say the space activity bill talks about private launches. They can set up the stage on, okay, what sort of insurance requirements have to be met, who bears the liability, what are the criteria based on which the license will be given, what happens when a license is terminated, and so on. And in addition to having these in the bills, they could have security standards, they could have safety standards, and all these set as within, let's say, policy documents that follow the bill itself. So it really depends on how they deal with it, and there's no way of saying that one is better than the other. It depends on let's say the business and the cultural context of the space industry and the ecosystem that we work in as well. In general, if you look at the global context, there are some countries who have every detail set out in the national space legislation itself. Again, going back to the French example, because they are the launch service providers with Arianespace, you do see that they deal more extensively with launch activities. Whereas in a different country, if they are more into, let's say, the downstream service sector, they have more principles on the remote sensing part of it. So I think in India as well, we have to take into account, okay, where do we see the biggest needs? And if they are not clear at this stage, or if we think it's too early to put everything in detail within the bill, that we start with a framework, that the boundaries are set, and we make it dynamic by adding policies and regulations that follow the bill at later stages or at times of maturity.
Can you give us a sense of what is the timeline like for some sort of space law to mature to an extent where it goes from starting of the process to actually being legislated and trickling down to the industry towards the fruits of that effort helping the industry kick off?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I think it depends on how we work with it. I would say the time to create a law is right now. There is a sense of urgency, not just because we have these young private players coming in, but also because we need to identify ourselves as a responsible space power. So just last year and this year with Swarm Technologies, the way they launched their Pico satellites without regulatory approval, neither from the SEC nor from India. And dealing with this as we don't know how that happened. That cannot happen anymore. So there is a sense of urgency for the law. I think with what we have now as a draft bill, if there is a dedicated stakeholder involvement, a really keen sense of having to do this or bring out a law within the shortest frame of time, it is doable within a year. It is entirely possible. It could be wishful thinking in some people's perspectives, but still, I think that is doable. And it has to be a continuing effect or a continuing effort, in the sense that the government needs to work closely with the academia and the industry to see what sort of gaps already exist, what can be filled in at this stage, and what do we need to set frameworks for that can be accommodated in the next few years. In my opinion, I think within the Indian space industry, the private sector, a lot can happen within the next 5 years. And if the stakeholder involvement that I spoke about, if that is done, let's say trickling down the principles, the regulations to the industry, to their supply chains and so on will not be so challenging. And another thing that has to go with it is, of course, doing a lot of outreach or creating public awareness about what is done. From a legal perspective, I would say that the Indian legal community, we are rich in terms of legal luminaries and academics. They don't necessarily have to all be from space law, but then they carry with them a lot of, let's say, rich wisdom from experience, from studying and so on, about how these laws for the future can be made. And I think it is about time that we tap into that. And in terms of a time frame, I would say within 2 years, we could have something set up. We could have the private industry up and running in a non-ambiguous, certain space activity, conducive business environment.
Does the lack of having a space legislative environment or a policy environment for some of these startups, in your opinion, affect their fundraising, affect international sentiment in terms of investor confidence?
I would say yes and no, because you probably know more about this, Narayan. But again, from a legal perspective, I would see that there are some risks if there is no law, or if there is no certainty on how a certain stimulus will have a certain response from the government. So I would say that if there is a law that tells in black and white that this is how things are done, these are the boundaries within which the industry is allowed to play, this is the sort of support they will get, in a way it will improve business sentiments as well. And with that, the investors, let's say if you're looking for investors within India or abroad, it makes things much easier if there is certainty. No, it's not like there is a wild west right now, but then things can go any which ways. Let's assume there are heavy burdens in terms of a licensing mechanism that the government puts in, or heavy penalties for a breach of one of the license conditions. I think that is definitely a risk that the investors will take into account. And for now, the way it is, there is no certainty on which side the balance can tip. So if these are clarified, it will add a lot of strength for the industry.
One of the challenges in India when you look at the structure of the Department of Space is that chairman of ISRO is also the secretary of the Department of Space, and he is also the chairman of the Space Commission. So it's the reporting structure, I guess, was made very simple during the time of the beginning of the space program, so that Vikram Sarabhai had total control of the entire space program that way. And to this day, that reporting structure has not been changed. And now the same person is the boss of the person, and he's also the boss of the person. So it's like triple level boss being the same person, right? This really brings the question of conflict of interest in terms of the ability of ISRO and the Department of Space to actually make regulations that brings together a neutral playground for all stakeholders to be involved. So given that this is the challenge for a good set of space legislation and policies to get out of India, what would be your prescription to solve some of these things?
I may be repeating a few things that I mentioned already. So this again goes back to the point about stakeholder involvement. And for me, what is really missing right now is that you have legal advisors for the Department of Space. Some of the names that I mentioned earlier, Dr. Ranjana Kaul, and many others, these people have a whole lot of knowledge about how things work in the international context. And I think they need to be involved in the process of lawmaking. So it can't be left to just drafters who have no context about how space legislations work in practice, how different countries deal with different issues in different ways. And I think the first stakeholder, as I would say, is involving the space lawyers actively in the lawmaking part. And the second party or the second group of stakeholders that need to be involved are the industry, the nascent industry and the technicians. It's very, anybody who reads the space activities bill right now can see that it is a product of the government. It doesn't seem like any of these stakeholders were involved. It doesn't seem like even if they were involved, any of their interests were reflected in the right way. That cannot be the case if we need to go ahead and if we need to find our own position in the space community. So for me, the prescription is again to have stakeholder involvement, to give enough validity for their voices, because we are no more in a stage where things will be run only by the government. That's my prescription.
When do you think somebody like you would see India as a mature, or we talked about already, India being an upcoming scene for space activities, and because of the new actors coming in, but when would you see as, for you personally, for example, it would make sense to, let's say, go back to India and contribute to the space law? Or do you see that being abroad itself, people like you who are experienced in this field and are trying to do different things and have an international perspective can contribute back? So how do you see the future panning out?
For me personally, I would really like to come back and work with the space industry in India. I think with the growth now, you see that with more and more companies coming up, I do see a lot of work that will be available, but not right now, in the near future. But I would say a level of maturity is reached again when ISRO sees this industry not just as a mere supplier chain, that we are equals, we are sums of a bigger whole. And then when there is enough activity, when there are enough interactions from ISRO, from its commercial arm Antrix, from the industry, and how that feeds back to the government in terms of shaping policies and regulations, I think that's when I would see a role not just for me, but also for the other space lawyers. And I think that will come soon, but it's not there right now.
Let's hope that this thing matures, and let's just hope that the future is bright, and all the stakeholders will be involved in all of these things, and hopefully the likes of people like you can go back and start contributing.
Thank you, Narayan. Really looking forward to that point of time.
Deepika, thank you very much for taking a lot of the time during the weekend to speaking to me. I think it's been a real pleasure knowing you and knowing about your work, and I wish you luck for the future.
Thank you, Narayan, and it was great to be on your podcast. I must say, before I bid by, that you're doing an amazing job with these podcasts, and it is so nice to have Indian voices being represented through your platform.
Thank you for staying until the end. If you have any comments or suggestions, please write to curator@newspaceindia.com. Please consider sharing this episode with any friends or family who may be interested in learning about India's space activities. If you would like to stay in touch with the NewSpace India community, please use the link in the description to join the NewSpace India Telegram group. Feel free to also suggest guests for any future episodes. A new episode of the NewSpace India podcast is released every other Friday. Do subscribe to the podcast using Apple, Google, or any other podcasting platforms you may use. Thank you.